1070.
Good afternoon. Victoria Noon continues here on CFAX 1070 as we move into our lunch bunch portion of the program where we discuss and debate the issues of the day. Today we're going to be talking about the cost of justice here in British Columbia. As we all know, the Conservatives' omnibus crime bill is a done deal. It has become law. We are going to be seeing increased costs because we're going to see more things like mandatory minimum sentences for marijuana crimes as well as others. One of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this today is that Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer, Kevin Page, has weighed in on a number of issues, most notably the F-35 stealth fighter program. Now, back before the last election, Kevin Page wrote a report saying that the F-35 stealth fighters were going to cost a lot more than the government said that they were. At the time, the government said, no, they won't. We disagree. We dismiss this. Well, as I'm sure you've heard by now, the Auditor General of Canada issued a report this week in black and white proving that not only will the F-35s cost more, but also that it seems that government knew about it the whole time. They knew, according to this report, that these F-35 fighters would cost more. Well, Kevin Page isn't just commenting about F-35 fighters. He's also been commenting about the tough on crime omnibus crime bill and how much more it's going to cost. So, of course, the question everyone's asking is if we're going to have more people in jail more often, if we're going to get rid of things like 2-for-1 sentencing, which has already happened, how many more people are going to be crammed into jails here in BC? How much are BC taxpayers going to have to spend to A, build these new jails, and B, make sure that they're properly staffed? Well, turns out that Kathy Corrigan, BC NDP opposition critic for public safety, had these same questions on her mind. Kathy, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Now, rather than fill out a huge, complicated Freedom of Information request to get this sort of information from the government, I don't actually need to because it turns out that your party already has. Tell us about the report that you got back from government when you asked how much these changes that the federal government is making would cost provincial taxpayers.
Well, we were really pleased. We got well over 300 pages back, and when we got that, we were really excited until we started going through it and realized that virtually every number was erased from the document, had been whited out. So we got 300 plus pages of words and a whole bunch of white blanks, and so we didn't get anything. We didn't get anything in terms of figuring out what the costs are going to be, and I don't understand it because I think it's something that BC taxpayers have a right to know what is going to be imposed on them as we get this huge wave of costs coming into the system. They deserve to know, and I really don't understand why the government is hiding it.
Do you think the government knows? I mean, the federal government will know. They had to have done cost projections, but do you think the province knows?
Well, I don't think that they do fully know. What they've done is clear from these documents is that they have started to put the documentation together. They have made, it looks like some estimates, but so much is blanked out that it's really hard to know exactly how far they've gone. So it's what they have done, we don't know exactly, and what they have done, they've hidden from us. So it's really hard to say at this point. But they've known about this Bill C-10 coming for a long time. The Conservatives in the last election promised, if elected, that they would bring back all those bills that had earlier fallen away, that hadn't been passed. They were going to put them all together, and they said they were going to pass them almost immediately. So they've known about it for a long time, and yet the planning hasn't happened. I know from the documents that we got, for example, there was reference to federal provincial ministers meeting about the issue of justice in 2010, and so it's not like they haven't been meeting. It's not like they haven't been talking, and yet we don't have any estimates. And frankly, I think it's pretty irresponsible that we've gone this far down the line. The bill is now law, and we don't know how much it's going to cost British Columbian taxpayers.
What obligation, if any, does the federal government have to cover these costs, which it is imposing by changing the laws?
Well, they don't. They don't have an obligation. We have constitutional responsibilities, but that hasn't stopped other provinces from saying, you have to help us, and they're continuing to say it. Quebec and Ontario, Quebec particularly has said, we are going to continue asking, demanding that the federal government, if they're going to bring in laws that are going to put more prisoners in our prisons, inmates in our prisons, and they need to cover the costs, and they're continuing to say that, and not a peep came from the BC government.
Just one example of what Kevin Page has warned about with this particular bill. I believe it was $145 million price tag for getting rid of house arrest. That was just one part?
Yeah, as use of conditional sentences, he said that would cost the provinces, for example, $750 million over the next 5 years. So, I mean, there are really large costs associated with it, and we just don't know how much that is. And not only is it lack of planning in terms of costs, it's also it's also trying to deal with the fact that we already have an overburdened justice system, and you've been hearing lots of stories about criminals being let off because
alleged criminals. We need to be careful.
Alleged criminals. Well, in some cases, in at least one case, we had somebody who had actually been convicted, and the judge said, "I have convicted this person, but they are going to be released because the time because it's been too long for them to be brought to justice." So, alleged, yes, but somewhere the facts were pretty clear, but they got off. And so we're talking puppy killers, we're talking cocaine dealers, we're talking drunk drivers, somebody who assaulted a police officer, somebody who had $500,000 worth of cocaine, all of those where they have specifically been let off, where the judge has said, we're letting this person off because it's too long getting them to justice. And that's just not appropriate at all. It certainly doesn't protect the public.
This is particularly interesting because we've already seen what some would call a fight brewing between the judiciary and the government just on the way things are now. This is before the Omnibus Crime Bill takes over. We've had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court here in British Columbia draw attention to the issue of chronic underfunding and how it's harming the system. The system's not. We've had also the Chief Justice and other justices write a letter to the government reminding them of judicial independence. And, of course, we had Kevin Kruger be oh so charming in the Legislative Assembly when he accused judges of politicking, or a judge of politicking, because of a dismissal in a recent case. Now, I found it very, very interesting that he said those things while protected by parliamentary privilege, but I don't recall him actually repeating them outside where a judge could take legal action to defend him or herself.
Yeah, and wherever somebody says that, it indicates an attitude. I absolutely. For Kevin Kruger, that was him, and I don't think it does reflect. I hope it doesn't reflect the liberal attitude towards the judiciary generally. But I do think that government has really been pushing the judiciary beyond probably what is appropriate, and they did pull back. I think there was a certain recognition of that saying, a bit of a mea culpa, saying, yes, we understand that the justices, that the judicial system is independent. But what the judicial system, what the judges are saying is simply that, look, the system is in crisis, and we need to do something about it. We have people getting off. We have long delays. We have shortages of sheriffs, so we have courtrooms where trials are being delayed or canceled because of shortages of sheriffs. And then, of course, at the end of it, we get into once somebody has been found guilty, either they get a conditional sentence or they're going into our prisons. And our prisons are highly overcrowded. They're, sitting at the least estimate at 150% of capacity. And even when they're building new prisons, we've had documents that essentially say that we're going to, in the prisons, we're going to continue to double bunk people. So, we're at a crisis all through our justice system, and the government just doesn't seem to be preparing for it. And I'll tell you, with regard to this FOI that we got back with regard to C-10, not only do they not seem to know what the costs are and not preparing for those costs, there's nothing in the budget, this year's budget for it. So this year's budget specifically says that there is no accounting for Bill C-10 in this budget. That's what it essentially says. So it seems like ineffective planning and preparation for something that the government knew was coming for a long time.
That is particularly interesting because this budget, of course, is the government's very aggressive plan to try to balance the budget before the next election. I know they say the 2013 fiscal, but that's what it is. They want to do it before they go back to the electorate. They have to. They're, in fact, as you well know, going to be selling off public buildings here in the Victoria area to try to balance their budget.
Yes.
For them to have no extra money built in to deal with C-10 when people like the parliamentary budget officer are telling us it's going to be costing millions of dollars more per year, hundreds of millions if you spread it across the provinces over the long term, that suggests, to me at least, that perhaps we might not get a balanced budget as fast as we had hoped if these changes turn out to be very damaging.
Well, that's right. There's nothing even in the contingency lines of the budget for the costs. So I could even see if they said, look, we don't know what the costs are because maybe they don't. Apparently they haven't done the work. But at least it should be entered as a contingency, as a risk to the government, and it's not there. It's like they're closing their eyes to these millions and millions of dollars of costs that are going to come to the government and or to the taxpayers of British Columbia. And other provinces have estimated what it's going to cost. So we have in the case of Quebec, they've said $1 billion, and we need help from the provincial government or from the federal government. Ontario, I believe, has estimated the cost around $600 million. So we're talking very significant costs, and on top of a system that is already stretched to breaking in many cases, very overcrowded, and according to the justices, underfunded. Now, that doesn't serve anybody. So what we end up having also is a lack of access. Another area that is not directly related, I guess, but is relevant, is the lack of access to legal aid. And I've heard judge after judge that I've talked to personally say the lack of access to legal aid is creating a great injustice and is creating further disarray in our court system, because you have many self-represented or unrepresented people going to court, either family court or criminal court. They don't have a lawyer representing them.
Yeah.
And, you save a couple of bucks now, but the time that is spent in an expensive courtroom, the extra time that you spend in an expensive courtroom, more than counters any savings that you might have. And there's also a question of justice. Should a woman who is trying to fight a custody battle, might lose her children, or may have made allegations of abuse, or a variety of different scenarios, should that woman be going to court without a lawyer representing her? It's not appropriate if she shouldn't, or a man. It's not appropriate in many cases that there is a lack of access to justice. So that's a real concern as well.